Was he considered a good trick roper?
What about riding? Oh, he was a great rider. In fact, I think that was his strength as a polo player. He never was really, actually, a very good polo player. His mallet work was always weak, but he made up for that in his riding ability. And, we have several pictures made of him where he just bangs into these other horses and knocks them out of the way. It was his riding skill, I think.
He rode in several movies, didn't he?
Oh, yes. He rode in most of the movies. He made one movie, his own, in which he did all the riding himself, and in which he came right straight off a cliff. And they said, well, Will, you've got to get a double for this. And he says, no, this is made at my own expense. I can't afford a double. So he went right off the cliff himself. Oh, he was a great rider.
You take care of it.
That's the only way you could have stopped it.
When you talk about paying for it, that brings up the guys that make the cars and the men that make the money. What about big business?
Well, big business and my father's attitude towards that, I think that he was definitely a Midwesterner. He never could understand interest, and really, basically, he was kind of opposed to Wall Street and the bankers. At one time, some of you looking in, some of the old-timers, might remember there was a story that the New York Stock Exchange was going to have to move across the river to New Jersey because New York City was going to put a city tax on them. So a lot of the newspapers were all full of stories about how hard it was, how difficult for the stock exchange to move, how important the stock exchange was to our economy and all that kind of thing. So my father wrote in his little daily column that next day. He said, I see where they're going to move the New York Stock Exchange across the river to New Jersey. I can't think of anything that could move easier. All they have to do is just change their telephone number and tell the loafers where to meet tomorrow. You know, in those days, they were selling short on the market. That is, people were selling stock they didn't own and then would buy it back again. Dad was always opposed to that. He said that whenever you buy or sell something, it's got to change hands, whether it's a rat trap or a barrel or whatever it is. And he says, the trouble with this country is that we're always buying something we never get from a man that never had it.
He was quite an avid fan of politics as an art, wasn't he?
Yes. In fact, I think that if he is to be remembered over the generations to come, he will probably be best remembered for his political commentary and his political analysis. They hold up surprisingly well over the years. And I think you can't be a true student of the 20s and the 30s and understand what was going on in those periods without having read his daily comments on politics each day.
Will, was your father a Democrat or Republican?
Oh, he was neither. And he was very, very careful and scrupulous not to be tied too closely to either party. Of course, he used to say, rather humorously, he said, I am a member of no organized political party. I am a Democrat, which was a pretty good laugh at the time, the Democratic Party being disorganized that period. But he was careful. If he had a criticism to make against the Democrats, he always tried to balance it with an equally strong criticism against the Republicans. And that was why, I think, politicians would accept from him criticism they wouldn't accept from anyone else. They knew that it was not intended bitterly, and they knew that it was intended only as a humorous remark and only as an analytical remark.
Did any politician ever take offense at anything he said at any time?
Yes, several times they did. But as my father pointed out, they were always the bitter and smaller politicians no man of presidential or senatorial caliber ever took offense.
One always thinks of your dad as being a very kind-hearted man. Did he ever punish you well?
Well, I remember one time when he did, and my mother tells me it's the only time that he ever spanked me. He had bought me a little suit, a velvet suit with the little short pants, and I wouldn't get into it. And he said, "Young man, you will get into it." And I said, "I will not." And he insisted I did, and he took me out and spanked me very hard. And that's the only time I remember it. And I asked my mother years later, and she says, "That's the only time that he ever spanked you." That's the only time that I recall. We took several trips together, I remember. We took a trip across the Transiberian Railway into Russia and then across Europe and back. And that was probably when I got to know him closest. But I actually didn't know him very well in my college years, and consequently, I really didn't appreciate him and his writings until after he'd passed on. It was only in reading these things years and years later that I began to realize how good they were. Oh, he was unquestionably the best roper of his day, yes. And many of the tricks that you see in the rodeos today, he invented. He invented many of the large ocean waves and many of the horse catches he did for the first time.
These are special names for rope tricks?
Special names for various tricky rope tricks, yes. Dad always practiced a great deal, and he liked to do things like this, I remember, in his vaudeville act. I'm doing them poorly because it's very hard to do little tricks, see. Dad always liked little loops that would roll over his head, and he used to do this, I'm getting it wrong. He used to do little tricks that would roll over his head very well, and he used his ropes to punch up his jokes. He would say a thing like this, for instance: "American foreign policy is an open book, generally a checkbook." Punch, with some particular rope trick just there to punch up that gag.
Well, this old stagecoach makes me wonder what your father's particular views on transportation were.
Well, he was in favor of it. He used to travel around a great deal, as you know, and generally he used to try and fly by airplane whenever he traveled around. But in his day, they also had a traffic problem, and it was just about as bad then as it is now. And he came up with what I think is the only solution to the traffic problem. And he says the only way you're going to solve this traffic problem that we have is to pass a law that you can't drive a car on the street until it's paid for.
Your dad had quite an interest in air travel, didn't he?
Oh, he certainly did. In fact, we've got some pictures of him in the early type pusher airplanes when he would be seated in a seat in front of the propeller, and the landing gear was just like a ski. Oh, that would be about I'd say 1909, 1910. And he always flew wherever he was. One of the articles he wrote that stands up best was a Saturday Evening Post article, which was a plea for commercial aviation. And he was also a great exponent of American air power.
Did he have any idea in his day of jet flights and so forth? Was there any talk of that then?
No. It was just that they would constantly go faster, however they would be powered. But when General Billy Mitchell got into his difficulty, I remember my father immediately flew to Chicago and was at Chicago during most of the court-martial trial. And he became very bitter during that time at the attacks on Mitchell.
He was a good friend of Mitchell's, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a very good friend of Mitchell's. And Dad used to constantly say in his lectures around the country, in the next war, America had better learn to fly or learn to dig. And this was long before other people were thinking that way.